I stood in the middle of the living room that Saturday morning in January, a plastic bucket in my hands, watching dark water drip through the cracked plaster above me. My breath came out in white clouds inside the house. The cold had settled into the walls weeks ago, and no matter how many layers I wore, it never left. Outside, I could hear my mother Eleanor laughing with my sister Chloe as they loaded into their new SUV. They were heading downtown for lunch to celebrate Chloe's brand new condominium, the one my parents had paid for in full. I picked up the phone and called my father. I told him the roof had finally given way and that black mold was spreading across my bedroom wall. I asked if someone could come look at it before the damage got worse. Richard's voice came through flat and impatient. "You're a grown man, Marcus. We gave you a rent-free house. Stop acting so entitled and be grateful you aren't on the streets. Your sister has a career to build, she needs a proper environment. You should be happy we even let you live in your grandfather's old place." He hung up before I could answer. I set the phone down and walked into my old bedroom. The mold had climbed another few inches overnight. I stared at it until my eyes burned, realizing the house my parents had always called a generous gift had never been meant for me to live in comfortably. They had used it to keep the property maintained without paying for real repairs, while every spare dollar went to Chloe. My parents told everyone they had given me a house out of love. They left out the part about it being legally uninhabitable and slowly poisoning me. They thought they could keep using my labor to hold the value up until they sold it and split the money with Chloe. What they did not realize was that one call to the city inspector would expose decades of illegal construction and force them to choose between spending $500,000 on repairs or losing the rest of their holdings. To understand how my parents convinced themselves that a collapsing ceiling was a gift, you have to understand the toxic hierarchy they built from the moment my sister and I were born. I grew up understanding one thing clearly: Chloe was the star of the family, and I was the maintenance crew. I never fought it. I was a quiet kid who liked taking things apart and putting them back together, and by the time I turned 25, I had built a solid career as a mechanical technician. I worked long shifts fixing industrial equipment, came home covered in grease, and lived frugally. I saved every dollar I could because I believed that eventually my parents would notice how hard I worked and finally respect me the way they respected Chloe without her lifting a finger. Richard and Eleanor ran a thriving property management company in our city. They projected an image of polished success, driving European sedans and hosting charity galas where they introduced themselves as community philanthropists. My mother curated their social media presence carefully. Every post showed a life of luxury and generosity. Behind the scenes, however, their family operated on strict favoritism. Chloe was the golden child, a 23-year-old social media coordinator who struggled to hold down any position for more than 6 months. She had never paid a bill in her life, and she viewed my blue-collar work with open condescension. At family dinners, she would refer to me as the family handyman and laugh as if that summed up my entire worth. The only person who ever treated me differently was my grandfather Charles. He was a retired carpenter who had built his modest 3-bedroom home with his own rough hands 40 years earlier. When I was 12, he started teaching me how to patch drywall, fix a leaky faucet, and rewire a light switch. He would sit on his porch and tell me that knowing how to build something was more valuable than any degree because it meant you could never be made helpless. He died when I was 26, and that was when the family dynamic tightened into something unmistakably predatory. Charles left his house to my parents as part of his estate. It was an aging structure in an older neighborhood, and the roof had needed replacing for years. The foundation had settled awkwardly, and the wiring was still the original fabric-insulated cable from decades past. My parents knew the cost of renovating it would be astronomical. So they did what they always did when they had a liability they wanted to turn into an asset: they offered it to me. Eleanor sat me down and told me they were giving me the most generous gift imaginable. "Live here rent-free," she said. "Save your money and take care of the place. You can use all those skills Grandpa taught you." I was genuinely touched. For the first time, I felt like my parents were investing in my future. I accepted immediately. What I did not realize was that there was no lease, no written agreement, and the deed stayed locked inside my parents' real estate LLC. I was not a homeowner, I was an unpaid property caretaker. Over the next 3 years, I poured more than $15,000 of my own savings into that house. I repainted every room, replaced the corroded plumbing in the kitchen, and restored the overgrown yard into a neat garden. My mother posted photos of me working on the house for her social media followers, writing captions like, "Helping our son buy his first fixer-upper, so proud." Privately, whenever I asked them to help cover the cost of the failing roof or the electrical panel that sparked every time it rained, my father would wave me away. "You're living there for free," he said. "We've already set you up for life. Be resourceful." They ignored my warnings completely, even as the ceiling in the living room grew soft and the smell of mildew crept up from the crawlspace. I spent 3 years pouring my sweat and hard-earned money into that house, thinking I was building a future. But I was actually just raising the property value for a family that was waiting to cash in. To understand how deep this wound went, I have to go back further than just the house. Every financial decision in my life followed a pattern designed to keep me exactly where they wanted me, useful, indebted, and silent. During my junior year of college, tuition costs spiked unexpectedly. I didn't ask my parents for help. Instead, I worked double shifts at the factory and took out $30,000 in student loans. I told myself I wouldn't burden them. They never offered anyway. They simply claimed we were financially tight. 1 month after I finally graduated with that debt hanging over me, my father drove up in a brand new Porsche Boxster. It was a gift for my sister Chloe's 21st birthday. The price tag was higher than my total undergraduate debt combined. I remember standing in the driveway watching the key fob flash as he handed it to her. He looked at me and mentioned my student loans lightly, suggesting maybe I should manage my budget better. I didn't argue. Arguing meant losing control of the only thing I had left, my reputation as the responsible son. That silence taught me that my value was measured by my obedience, not my success. As I settled into adulthood, my role solidified into something darker. Whenever Richard owned a rental property that needed plumbing work or broken appliances, my phone would ring. I would drive over, tools in hand, and fix everything. Sometimes it was a late Friday night. Sometimes it was early Sunday morning. Richard told me this was me paying my keep for living in my grandfather's house. If I hesitated, my mother Eleanor would twist the knife. She'd tell me I was being selfish and ungrateful for not helping the family business. They weaponized my conscience against my own best interests. This dynamic created a financial trap I couldn't see until later. By keeping my weekends consumed by their emergency repairs and demanding I maintain the family assets, they ensured I had no time or capital to invest in my own future. I was working so hard to preserve their wealth that I forgot to build my own. I couldn't put a down payment on a townhouse because my cash reserves were bleeding into my parents' maintenance fund. I watched Chloe spend her tax return on a vacation while I paid for the HVAC system on one of their empty units. My savings were non-existent because I was pouring my resources into an estate that legally belonged to my parents. The hypocrisy became unbearable when Chloe announced she wanted to move closer to the city center. She didn't work long hours or take loans. Without hesitation, Richard and Eleanor liquidated a significant portion of their joint investment portfolio. They bought her a $450,000 luxury condominium outright. The deed was in her name, pristine and untouched by any code violations or repair bills. Her unit had granite countertops and private parking, while I lived with a leaky ceiling and no heat budget. When I confronted them, comparing my rotting roof to her shiny balcony, Eleanor didn't flinch. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "Chloe is a delicate girl. She can't live in a construction zone like you can. You're a man, you should like the challenge." That sentence changed everything. It wasn't about ability anymore. It was about entitlement based on gender and favoritism. I tried to swallow my pride and keep my head down during those conversations. I convinced myself I could endure it. But nature has a way of exposing rot, both in a house's foundation and in a family's heart. Eventually, the water finds the weakest point, and mine was about to give way. The collapse happened during the third day of the thaw. The heavy, wet snow had finally melted, and the rain came down in relentless sheets. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a sound like a giant sigh from above, followed by a thunderous crash from the living room. I ran in to find a jagged hole in the plaster ceiling, water pouring through the attic insulation, and my grandfather's old armchair soaked and ruined beneath it. The roof had finally given up. Within days, the smell arrived. It was a musty, earthy, sickly sweet odor that clung to everything. I knew it immediately: black mold. The moisture had seeped into the walls, and soon the corners of my bedroom bloomed with dark, fuzzy patches. I started coughing, a persistent, hacking thing that wouldn't quit. My head throbbed with a dull, constant pressure. I felt run down, feverish. I was living in a house that was actively making me sick, and the one person who could fix it was the man who owned it, my father. I tried to be rational. I got 3 professional estimates for roof repair and mold remediation. The lowest quote was $28,000. I printed the documents, took photos of the collapsed ceiling and the spreading mold, and drove to my parents' house on Saturday evening. They were hosting a family dinner to celebrate Chloe's condo closing. I told myself this was a family matter. I would present the facts, and they would see the danger. They would do the right thing. The house was warm and smelled of roasted rosemary and expensive wine. Chloe and her fiancé, a finance guy named Derek, were holding flutes of champagne. My mother beamed, showing them the custom marble countertops in the new kitchen. I stood in the foyer for a moment, the damp, mildewed smell of my own clothes a stark contrast to this polished air. I felt like an intruder from another world. I pulled out my folder during a lull in the conversation about mortgage interest rates. "I need to talk to you about the house," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. I laid the photos on the dining room table next to the cheese platter. The collapsed ceiling. The black mold creeping up the drywall. The estimate, $28,000. My father didn't pick up the papers. He glanced at the first photo, then waved a hand dismissively. $28,000? Are you insane? His voice was loud, sharp, cutting through the room's cozy hum. We aren't wasting that kind of money on an old shack. Buy some bleach, spray the walls, and put a tarp on the roof. It's not that complicated. He looked at me, his expression one of profound irritation, as if I'd brought a dead animal to the table. If you don't like it, you can move out. There are plenty of people who would kill to live there for free. Chloe giggled, a light, tinkling sound. She nudged Derek. See? I told you he's always making a dramatic production out of everything. She turned to me, her smile not reaching her eyes. Maybe you should just get a real job, Marcus. Then you could afford your own place. My mother reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bottle of children's cough syrup. She held it out to me. Here. This will help with that cough. You're being so dramatic, you're going to give yourself a real illness. She laughed lightly, as if she'd just told a gentle joke. Don't ruin the celebration. We're toasting to Chloe's beautiful new home. I stood there, the plastic bottle in my hand, the photos spread before my father like an accusation no one was reading. The warmth of the room pressed against my skin, but I felt colder than I had in my drafty living room. I looked at their faces, my father's exasperation, my mother's patronizing pity, my sister's smug amusement. They weren't looking at a son or a brother. They were looking at a problem. A whiny, inconvenient, cheap problem who had finally overstepped by asking for something that cost real money. The realization didn't come in a flash. It was a slow, chilling dawning. This wasn't about the house being a fixer-upper. It was about me being the fixer. My purpose was to absorb the cost, the labor, the toxicity, so they wouldn't have to. My suffering wasn't a side effect, it was the point. My cough wasn't a symptom of mold, it was a punchline. My debt wasn't an accident, it was a design. I didn't argue. There was no point. I carefully gathered the photos and the estimate, folded them, and slid them into my back pocket. I placed the unopened cough syrup on the sideboard. You're right, I said, my voice eerily calm. It's not complicated at all. I drove home in silence. The rain had stopped, but the cold had seeped into the bones of the car. I kept thinking about my grandfather, Charles, building that house with his own hands. He built it to shelter his family. My parents were using it as a weapon. They didn't just want me to be grateful for a crumbling house. They wanted me to be grateful for the privilege of being the one who crumbled inside it. They wanted my suffering to be silent, invisible, and productive for them. I pulled into my driveway and looked at the dark hulk of the house. The orange condemned sign the city would eventually post felt like it should already be there. I had been playing a game with rules they made up, on a field they owned. I was done. I realized then that they didn't just want me to be grateful, they wanted me to suffer in silence so they could feel superior. So, I decided to let a neutral third party take a look at their generous gift. After leaving my parents' warm dining room that night, I sat in my freezing car for a long time before driving home. The cough had grown worse, and every breath tasted like mold. For the first time I wasn't asking them for help. I was done waiting. The next morning I called the municipal building and safety department. I didn't call as a complaining tenant. I identified myself as the primary resident reporting serious health and safety violations that were making me physically sick. They scheduled a full code inspection for the following Tuesday. When the inspector arrived, I immediately recognized the look on his face. Mr. Delgado was a veteran with over 30 years on the job. He carried a heavy flashlight and a worn clipboard, and he didn't waste words. I walked him through the house in silence. The moment we entered the living room and he saw the collapsed ceiling with water still dripping through the exposed rafters, his shoulders tensed. By the time we reached my bedroom and he shone his light on the thick black mold growing behind the drywall and into the HVAC vents, his expression had hardened into something between disbelief and anger. It went far beyond the damage I had shown my parents. In the backyard, Mr. Delgado discovered that 10 years earlier my father had hired unlicensed day laborers to build a large deck and an enclosed sunroom addition. There were no permits, no structural engineering stamps, and no updated tax assessments. The city had no record the addition even existed. He tapped the support beams and shook his head, muttering that the entire structure was unsafe and would likely need to be torn down at the owner's expense. Inside, the violations kept coming. When he opened the electrical panel in the basement, he actually stepped back. The wiring was a hazardous, illegal patchwork of outdated components that had never been brought up to code. It violated multiple municipal fire safety laws and posed an immediate risk of electrical fire. But the worst discovery waited beneath the house. In the crawlspace, the main sewer line was cracked and had been leaking raw sewage directly into the dirt for years. The biohazard was extreme. Mr. Delgado emerged coughing, his face pale, and told me the smell alone was enough to condemn the property. Because the house was titled under Richard and Eleanor's Real Estate LLC, they were legally liable for every violation. Mr. Delgado looked at me and said the home was being officially condemned as uninhabitable and hazardous to human health. He pulled out an orange notice and nailed it to the front door himself. Then came the revelation that changed everything. He closed his notebook, looked me in the eye, and said, "Your landlords are in massive trouble. By renting or housing anyone in a structure this neglected under an LLC, they are subject to triple damages, daily compounding fines, and a mandatory structural overhaul. The city is going to freeze their ability to lease or sell any of their LLC's other properties until this is fully brought to code." I stood on the porch watching his truck disappear down the street, the orange sign flapping in the January wind. All those years of being told to be grateful suddenly made sense in the coldest possible way. My parents had believed they were clever by keeping the deed in their company name to dodge personal taxes and responsibility. They didn't realize they had just tied their entire real estate business to a sinking, toxic ship. My hands were still shaking when I went back inside to pack a bag. The real shock wasn't the condemnation. It was finally understanding how long they had known the house was dangerous and how little they had cared that it was destroying me. I didn't wait for them to call. I moved quickly, treating my departure like a tactical extraction rather than an emotional retreat. Over 2 days, I packed my clothes, my tools, and every box of my grandfather's personal records into heavy-duty bins. I secured a modest one-bedroom apartment across town, signing a 12-month lease that felt like a breath of clean air. Before I handed over the keys to the condemned house, I spent hours organizing every receipt, invoice, and bank statement from the past 3 years. I printed out the text messages where my father dismissed my repair requests, and the emails where my mother told me to handle the plumbing myself. I backed everything onto 2 separate hard drives and handed a copy to my lawyer. The city moved with bureaucratic precision. 3 days after the inspection, a crew arrived and nailed the official orange condemnation notice to the front door. They also delivered a certified packet containing 47 distinct code violations directly to my parents' corporate headquarters. The document listed everything from the illegal sunroom addition to the fractured sewer line, each item carrying a daily compounding fine until corrected. I knew the moment that envelope landed on Richard's desk, the illusion of their control would shatter. I retained a tenant rights attorney who specialized in landlord negligence and constructive eviction. Because I had never signed a formal lease, my legal standing relied on proving an implied tenancy. My attorney filed a civil suit demanding full reimbursement for the $15,000 I had spent on unauthorized maintenance, plus medical damages for the documented mold exposure. We argued that my parents had effectively forced me to live in a hazardous environment while extracting free labor to preserve their asset. It was a straightforward claim, but it required me to sever the emotional tether I had spent my entire life trying to maintain. The backlash was immediate and predictable. Richard called my new number 23 times in 2 days. When I finally answered, he was screaming, his voice cracking with panic and rage. He accused me of destroying the family name and threatened to sue me for reporting them to the city. I listened for exactly 10 seconds, then hung up and blocked every number associated with them. All future communication was routed through my attorney's office. I refused to engage in their theater. Eleanor tried a different tactic. She contacted my aunts, uncles, and family friends, spinning a narrative that I was a vindictive son trying to bankrupt my parents out of spite. She sent my cousin to my apartment to tell me I was ruining Chloe's future. Apparently, the city had placed a blanket lien on all properties held under the family LLC, including the luxury condo my parents had just bought her. Chloe was suddenly facing frozen assets and a wedding fund that had evaporated. I looked at my cousin, handed him a bottle of water, and told him I wasn't doing this to hurt them. I was doing it to survive. He left without another word. They wanted me to be grateful for a house that was poisoning me. Now, they were about to find out exactly how much that gratitude was going to cost them. The fallout came faster than my parents could control the narrative. To lift the city liens and avoid criminal prosecution for the housing violations, Richard and Eleanor were forced to completely gut my grandfather's house. They tore out the illegal sunroom and deck, replaced the entire roof structure, removed every trace of toxic black mold, rewired the dangerous electrical system, and repaired the cracked sewer line that had been leaking into the crawlspace for years. What began as my desperate plea for a safe ceiling ended up costing them over $180,000 in mandated repairs, professional remediation, daily compounding fines, and lost rental income while their LLC remained frozen. The pressure rippled outward. Because their corporate assets were locked during the legal battle, my father had to take out a massive high-interest mortgage against Chloe's luxury condominium just to pay the immediate penalties. The sister who had never paid a bill in her life suddenly faced reality. She was forced to get a real job in retail, working 40-hour weeks to cover the new mortgage payments herself. Her carefree, rent-free existence evaporated. Her fiancé postponed their wedding indefinitely, unwilling to join a family drowning in self-inflicted financial chaos. The golden child who once giggled at my suffering now understood what it felt like to carry the weight they had placed on me for years. Rather than risk a public trial that would have destroyed their carefully curated reputation as generous community philanthropists, their insurance company settled my lawsuit out of court for $95,000. It covered my medical bills from the mold exposure, my moving costs, and fairly reimbursed every dollar and hour of labor I had given them over 3 years. I used most of that settlement as a down payment on a beautiful, structurally sound townhouse across town. For the first time, I had walls that didn't leak, air I could breathe, and peace that belonged only to me. I went completely no contact. Their messages stopped coming after a few months. Standing in my new kitchen months later, I thought about that freezing Saturday morning when I held a plastic bucket catching dirty water while my father told me to be grateful. They had given me trash and kept the gold for themselves. In the end, their greed exposed their own rot. I am thriving in a home that is warm, safe, and truly mine. The best revenge is living well, far away from the toxic people who tried to bury you in their ruins.